The year is 1944, and on the battlefields of Europe, German forces stand poised with a sense of unrivaled superiority. Their belief in their military might, especially in their tanks, is absolute. The Tiger and Panther tanks, seen as masterpieces of engineering, symbolize the peak of German military innovation. Heavily armored and armed with powerful 88mm guns, these tanks were designed to outclass anything the Allies could bring to the front. German engineers and military leaders, convinced of their superiority, viewed these machines as invincible, an unbeatable force on the battlefield. But this overconfidence wasn't limited to the engineers who designed these tanks. It permeated the entire German high command. The belief in the strength of the Tiger and Panther was shared by the generals and soldiers alike. These tanks, more than just weapons, were symbols of national pride. The sheer firepower of the Tiger, with its long-range gun and thick armor, was thought to ensure victory over any Allied vehicle. The Panther, faster and more maneuverable, was hailed as a revolutionary machine that would dominate the battlefield. The Germans believed they had perfected warfare. Their tanks were the embodiment of their might, and the military command placed all their hopes on these machines to carry them through the war. Yet, while the German military hailed these tanks as invincible, they overlooked a critical flaw that would ultimately prove their undoing. Their belief in the superiority of the Tiger and Panther, while not entirely misplaced in terms of design, led to a dangerous underestimation of the Allies' adaptability and ingenuity. What the Germans failed to realize was that in warfare, confidence can often be a liability. As the Allies prepared for the liberation of Europe, the overconfidence of the German military would soon meet a force that would challenge everything they thought they knew about war. In stark contrast to the German belief in their superior tanks, the American M4 Sherman tank was initially regarded as an underdog. Lighter, less heavily armored, and with a smaller gun than the mighty Panther or Tiger, the Sherman was dismissed by many as inferior. On paper, it was no match for its German counterparts. Yet, the Sherman had something the German tanks lacked: its sheer numbers. The Americans weren't focused on building the heaviest or most powerful tank. Instead, they produced thousands of Shermans, each one easy to manufacture, repair, and deploy in large numbers. This strategic advantage would prove to be a decisive factor in the war. When the Allies launched their invasion of Normandy in June 1944, the Shermans were there, flooding the battlefield in vast numbers. They weren't just tools of brute force. They were part of a larger, well-coordinated military strategy. While the German tanks excelled in individual engagements, the Americans understood that warfare was not about one-on-one combat. It was about overwhelming the enemy with combined arms tactics, coordinated strikes, and an unrelenting flow of troops and equipment. The Americans didn't rely solely on the Sherman's firepower. Instead, they utilized its mobility and ability to operate in concert with infantry, artillery, and air support. This gave the Shermans an edge in terms of flexibility. They could attack from multiple directions, adapt to changing battlefield conditions, and most importantly, keep the pressure on the Germans with constant reinforcements. As the Sherman tanks rolled across the French countryside, the Germans were caught off guard by the sheer volume of their opponents. The Americans had learned from previous battles, and this time, they were ready. The M4 Sherman may not have had the devastating firepower of the Tiger or Panther, but in terms of tactical application, it was proving to be far more effective. The German high command, stunned by the overwhelming numbers of Shermans breaking through their defenses, had underestimated the one thing they could not account for: the American way of warfare. The M4 Sherman, though seen as a humble machine compared to the German giants, was proving that strategy and numbers often outweigh raw firepower. And as the battle for Normandy raged on, the Sherman was about to show the world just how powerful a seemingly inferior tank could be. By the time the Allies stormed Normandy, the German command had a clear, unwavering belief in the superiority of their iconic tanks, the Panther and Tiger. These war machines, meticulously engineered and designed with the finest technology Germany could offer, were viewed as the ultimate weapons of war. The German generals, confident in their prowess, believed that no tank could rival the Tiger's powerful 88mm gun or the Panther's combination of speed, maneuverability, and firepower. Their belief was not just in the tanks themselves, but in the engineering that went into every inch of their design. The Panther was widely regarded as the most formidable tank in the world when it came to its balance of speed and armor. With sloped armor and a powerful 75mm gun, it could engage enemies from afar with deadly precision. The Tiger, with its massive 88mm cannon, was capable of knocking out enemy armor at extreme distances, creating a fearsome reputation among Allied forces. These tanks were seen as the cornerstone of the German war effort, and they were highly revered on the battlefield. However, beneath this image of invincibility, cracks began to show. The Panther, despite its strength, had significant mechanical issues. Its engine was notoriously unreliable, and its complex construction made it difficult to repair in the field. The Tiger, while devastating in combat, was plagued by logistical challenges. Its heavy weight made it slow and inefficient, and its fuel consumption was staggering, leaving it stranded far from supply lines during long engagements. German commanders, blinded by their belief in the superiority of their tanks, failed to account for the logistical and maintenance issues that plagued their forces. They focused on building more advanced machines, believing that these tanks alone would secure victory. But as the war dragged on, the reality began to set in. These tanks, for all their firepower, were not invincible. The Germans' obsession with perfecting these machines had led them to overlook the importance of operational efficiency and sustainability. Meanwhile, the Americans were focused on a different approach entirely: mass production and adaptability. The Germans had invested heavily in the idea of an elite tank force, but in doing so, they had left themselves vulnerable. The pride they had in their tanks blinded them to the emerging strategies of the Allies. The Germans had not yet realized that warfare was shifting, and their belief in the invincibility of the Panther and Tiger would soon be tested in ways they never expected. When the M4 Sherman first appeared on the battlefield, particularly in the brutal struggle for Normandy, it quickly became evident that this tank was not to be underestimated. On paper, it seemed underwhelming when compared to the German tanks, especially the Tiger and Panther, which had earned a reputation for their devastating firepower. The Sherman, with its lighter armor and less powerful 75mm gun, was seen as a mere shadow of these titans. Yet, as the conflict raged on, the Sherman revealed itself to be far more capable than its critics had imagined. The key to the Sherman's success wasn't in brute strength or firepower, it was in its versatility and the tactics used to deploy it. Unlike the German tanks, which often had to be carefully maintained and were prone to mechanical failure, the Sherman was designed to be mass-produced and easily repaired in the field. This ensured that American forces could keep a steady supply of these tanks on the front lines, unlike the Germans, who were increasingly hampered by mechanical breakdowns and logistical challenges. What made the Sherman especially dangerous was its integration into a larger, more coordinated military strategy. The American forces didn't rely on the tank alone. They deployed it in tandem with infantry, artillery, and air support, creating a network of attacking forces that could overwhelm German defenses. While the Sherman may have been outclassed in direct tank-to-tank combat, it thrived when used in combination with the full range of American military assets. Sherman tanks were also incredibly mobile, able to maneuver through the varied and often treacherous terrain of Western Europe. This mobility gave American forces the ability to surprise the enemy, hit fast, and then retreat before the Germans could regroup. The Sherman's ability to stay on the move was a key factor in the American strategy. It wasn't just about having the best tank, it was about using the tank in the best possible way. At Normandy, as the American forces surged forward, it became clear that the Sherman wasn't just holding its own, it was actively breaking the German defensive lines. The Americans had understood something the Germans had overlooked. Quantity and tactical flexibility could often be more powerful than sheer firepower. With its speed, mass production, and adaptable nature, the Sherman was proving that it had the power to break through, and the German forces, with all their superior tanks, couldn't match the overwhelming pressure brought by the Americans. The M4 Sherman, despite being considered inferior by many, was demonstrating that the war was not just about who had the better tank. It was about who could keep fighting, who could adapt, and who could maintain the pressure. And in Normandy, it was clear the Sherman was doing just that. By the time the M4 Shermans reached the heart of Normandy, German engineers, who had long relied on the superiority of their tanks, were forced to reassess everything they had believed about warfare. The sight of hundreds of Shermans rolling across the French countryside, seemingly unstoppable, was not only a tactical shock, it was an emotional blow to the engineers who had built their mighty Panthers and Tigers with such care and pride. These tanks, which they had once thought would secure German victory, were now being overrun by the very force they had dismissed. The Germans, who had come to view their tanks as symbols of invincibility, were left in disbelief. The Sherman, far from being the weakling they had expected, was proving to be a formidable adversary. It wasn't just the sheer numbers of the Sherman tanks that was troubling. It was the way in which they broke through German defenses. The Americans weren't just throwing tanks at the enemy in a chaotic, disorganized rush. No, the Sherman's real power lay in the way it was integrated into a larger, multifaceted strategy. The Americans utilized their tanks as part of a well-coordinated, synchronized assault that included infantry, artillery, and air support. The Sherman's flexibility allowed it to work seamlessly with these other forces, creating a dynamic and unpredictable battlefield that kept the Germans on the defensive. German commanders, focused on their heavy tanks, were caught off guard by the speed and adaptability of the Sherman's deployment. For the German engineers, who had once believed that their tanks would dominate the battlefield, it was a bitter realization. The Sherman's strength didn't come from being the most powerful machine on the field. It came from being part of a bigger, smarter picture. While the Tiger and Panther could take down individual enemies with ease, the Sherman's ability to work in concert with other units overwhelmed German positions. The engineers who had designed the Panther and Tiger tanks could only watch as their creations were outmaneuvered and outlasted. They had underestimated not just the Sherman's capabilities, but also the evolving tactics of the American forces. The Sherman tank was, in many ways, a symbol of the changing nature of warfare, one where adaptability, speed, and coordination often triumphed over brute force. And for the first time, the German engineers began to understand that their tanks, however impressive, were no match for the relentless pressure of the American strategy. What would you have thought if you were a German engineer watching this unfold? Could it have shaken your confidence as much as it did theirs? As the war moved on, the Americans began to prove a critical point that would resonate far beyond the battlefields of Europe. Victory did not lie in the hands of the strongest weapon, but in the hands of the soldiers who could adapt, innovate, and synchronize their efforts. The M4 Sherman, often seen as inferior in terms of raw power, became the perfect example of how American forces had turned their approach to warfare into a strategic advantage. The key lesson was flexibility. The U.S. Army did not see warfare as a static contest of tanks against tanks or soldiers against soldiers. Instead, they understood that war was a dynamic, ever-changing environment. The Sherman tank, though less powerful than its German counterparts, was mobile and reliable. It could quickly respond to shifts in the battlefield, and its numbers meant that when one tank was disabled, another could take its place. This was the backbone of the American approach: mass production, quick repair, and constant deployment. The American strategy also focused on coordination. While the Germans had relied heavily on the power of individual tanks, the U.S. Army brought together tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support into a unified fighting force. In Normandy, it was clear that the American forces were not just relying on their tanks to break through defenses. They were using tanks as part of a larger strategy that overwhelmed the Germans from all directions. Infantry moved in concert with tanks, artillery softened up defenses before the tanks moved in, and air support struck at key targets from above. The Germans, used to relying on the strength of their tanks alone, were unprepared for this level of coordination and flexibility. The surprise wasn't just in the M4 Sherman's ability to break through German lines. It was in the fact that the U.S. Army had successfully implemented a holistic approach to combat that utilized every resource at their disposal. The Sherman tank was a cog in a much larger machine, and this was something the Germans had overlooked in their focus on individual technological superiority. As the Americans moved forward, it became clear that the true strength of their forces lay not in their tanks alone, but in their ability to adapt to every situation, to learn from every battle, and to continuously improve their strategies. The Germans, with all their pride in their powerful tanks, could not match the agility, coordination, and resilience of the Americans. It was a lesson in warfare that would have a profound impact not only on the outcome of the war, but on how future conflicts would be fought. What do you think is more important in warfare, superior technology or the ability to adapt? Looking back on the story of the M4 Sherman and its role in the Allied victory, one undeniable lesson stands out. Success in war is not simply about having the best weapon, but about how that weapon is used, how it fits into a broader strategy, and how forces can adapt to the evolving battlefield. While the German tanks, the Tiger and Panther, were powerful machines in their own right, the American forces demonstrated that tactics, flexibility, and innovation would prove more valuable than raw firepower. The story of the Sherman is a reminder that the best-laid plans and the most powerful technology cannot guarantee victory unless they are backed by a strategy that can evolve with the needs of the moment. The Americans may not have had the most formidable tanks in terms of individual power, but their approach, focused on quantity, mobility, and coordination, allowed them to overwhelm German defenses. The U.S. Army's ability to adapt, to learn from their mistakes, and to apply the lessons of the battlefield was key to their success. They didn't rely on one miracle weapon to win the war. Instead, they embraced a broader vision of warfare, one where coordination between infantry, tanks, artillery, and air support created a near-constant pressure on the enemy. This allowed them to keep the Germans off balance, never giving them a moment to recover or regroup. The war was ultimately not won by the most powerful weapon, but by the side that could outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast the other. The Americans were able to do this because of their willingness to adapt, their focus on constant improvement, and their ability to coordinate efforts across all levels of the battlefield. As history shows, no matter how formidable an enemy may seem, there is always room for change, for learning, and for applying new strategies. The story of the Sherman tank proves that no matter how technologically advanced an opponent is, determination, innovation, and the ability to adapt can turn the tide of battle. The M4 Sherman tank despite its perceived weaknesses, was ultimately a symbol of how tactical thinking, mass production, and the flexibility to change tactics on the fly led to the eventual defeat of one of the most powerful military forces the world had ever seen. What does this teach us about our own challenges today, whether in war or life?